Dear patrons, as we close out our week on what has historically been our nation's tax day, or Judgment Day as I call it, I'm thankful and honored to welcome our next presenter. An alumnus from our Zooming with LD series last year, the company has gone on to more than double in share price since October. Doubling up is always nice to see, but the more important thing is the number of lives they have improved with their know-how, science, and technology. The eyes are the most critical when it comes to our senses, and great vision is paramount to having a fulfilling and prosperous life. Alimera Sciences, ticker ALIM, on the NASDAQ is all about seeing better. The company is known for Illuvian, a micro implant in the back of the eye. With one injection, you can get up to 3 years of continuous treatment for DME, otherwise known as diabetic macular edema. I have been personally following the company for more than a decade and know how much time, energy, and money has gone into making Illuvian a success for everyone involved, especially those who have DME. In light of the difficulties of the pandemic, Alimera did over 50 million in revenue last year while maintaining positive adjusted EBITDA. The company also signed a transformative agreement contract yesterday with a large licensing deal for the Asian market. I think the street will eventually realize the value created of receiving $20 million from Ocumension Therapeutics. Joining us on the call today to talk about the company, Illuvian, and recent milestones, it is always an honor and pleasure to welcome President, CEO, and man who will most likely outclass you in a push-up contest, Mr. Rick Eisworth. Rick, it's pretty horrifying to me how 6 months have flown by. Congrats on the recent announcement, and the floor is now yours.
Great, Chris. Thanks for having me today. Really great to speak with everybody again. As the first slide says, retina disease is our focus, and I will tell you, Chris referenced in his opening comments there the fact that we do have an impact on patients' lives, and we're really focused in the retina space because changing retina disease and helping people see better, really adds a quality of life to people, and it makes us feel real good about what we're doing every day. And helping patients, frankly, see better longer. And in this case, with our drug, seeing better longer with fewer injections than the alternatives would provide them. But retina disease is our focus for a couple of other reasons as well. It's a place or a niche that I think provides a big opportunity for us because nobody has built a company that is solely focused around the retina specialists and their patients. There's only been 9 or 10 retina drugs approved in the history of the FDA. And most of those drugs are within much bigger companies that are treating front of the eye disease and back of the eye disease. And front of the eye disease is a much bigger space and a much larger number of physicians. Or they're focused in even bigger companies where it's the sole ophthalmology product like Eylea is in Regeneron. And Regeneron, as you probably know, is focused on coronavirus vaccines and other disease states. So really having a company that's centered around that retina specialist makes a lot of sense to us. And as we talk to retina specialists, they really like the idea of a company that can bring them multiple products. So as I take you through what we're trying to build here, it's to deliver that unique focus on the retina specialist. The other piece of that is, and it's more purely, looking at it from a financial perspective, is the retina space is also a very efficient space to be in. In the US, for example, there are 20,000 ophthalmologists that treat, front of the eye, back of the eye disease in general. And there's even a much larger number of optometrists. But those that purely focus on the retina is limited to about 2,000 physicians. And so we, from a commercial infrastructure, can cover 2,000 physicians very well and efficiently. And it's why, as Chris alluded to, we've been able to get to generating positive EBITDA, even in a challenging year like we have with COVID. So, a lot built into that retina disease focus there. I'm going to skip through the forward-looking statements. I know you're all familiar with those. From an investment thesis standpoint, we believe we've got an incredibly unique asset here. I call it a better mousetrap, and I really do think it's a better mousetrap or a better way to treat the disease. The drug's called Illuvian, and frankly, we're just trying to change the paradigm in the way physicians think about treating retina disease. Most retina disease is chronic or persistent. It's not going to go away. So you can't treat it for a day or a couple of days and have it go away. Most patients that are struck with retina disease are stuck with it for life. And unfortunately, it's typically those diseases are treated with acute therapies or short-term therapies as if it was an acute disease and it's going to go away. So we've got the only way to really reduce the recurrence there. And I'll get into the details of how it works a little bit more in a moment. It is a very established commercial business. This isn't a binary bet on a clinical trial. We've got an established commercial business that's growing very well. What's not on this page is, we did about 54 million in revenue in 2019, which was about 23% growth over the previous year. A 23% CAGR the couple of years leading into that. We were off related to COVID, but only about 6%. And we thought that was extremely good. And we actually managed the bottom line and generated quite a bit of EBITDA, about 3.5 million of EBITDA last year. We've already got a very leverageable commercial presence. I've got teams in Europe and the US. We're commercially available in about 12 countries right now between the US and Europe, and we can leverage that team. The other reason I want to bring another product to the retina specialist is anything that I could add to the bag right now, I can launch fairly effectively, and it's going to drop a lot of margin to the bottom line because I've already got the infrastructure built out, and there's not really anybody else that can say that in the retina space. In addition to that established business, we have what I think is sort of the excitement and sizzle that you might find in one of those more binary development companies. We've got option value in what we call the New Day study, which is the first of its kind head-to-head comparison of a corticosteroid and the standard of care in treating diabetic macular edema, which is anti-VEGF therapy. And it's a head-to-head comparison against our drug Iluvien and the $7.5 billion standard of care. So you can imagine if I can chip off a small piece of that 7.5 billion when I'm doing 50 million in revenue, there's a huge opportunity for me to grow and get to that hockey stick, that you might see in a more of a binary company. And again, the vision is to build that company around the retina space. But we say internally, we want to be the place to be in retina. And what I mean by that is we want to be the place to be in retina for doctors, retina specialists, for their patients, but also for employees that want to focus in the retina space and potential partners. And I'm trying to build out my network when I show that to you in a way that is more and more attractive for potential partners that want to launch drugs in this space, because it's very difficult to launch a product in ophthalmology as a single product company. And we think our network will add value over time. Our focus to date has been on what's called diabetic macular edema. Diabetic macular edema is the leading cause of blindness in diabetic patients. And so as you can probably imagine, because diabetes is a growing pandemic of its own, there are more and more patients suffering from diabetic macular edema every day. In the US, there's probably over 600,000, between 600 and 650,000 patients that have what is considered clinically significant macular edema, or it's having a material impact on their vision. And there's probably 100,000 incidents every year. So huge patient population continuing to flow through. What happens in diabetic macular edema is the blood vessels in the eye start to leak and fluid builds up in the back of the eye. So if you've ever seen a diabetic patient that gets swollen hands or swollen feet, and frankly, it used to lead to amputation, although it's managed a little bit better now. That same swelling has happened in the back of the eye, and the retina swells. And the comparison I like to make is if you remember the movie screens that used to pull out of the ceiling, or they would sit on a tripod and you'd shine a camera or a picture on those. If somebody stood behind that movie screen and pushed the picture out, the screen starts to lose its shape and the picture got blurry. Same concept is happening in the back of the eye, and you're building up fluid there, retina swelling, losing its shape, and you're getting blurry vision. So, and importantly, we believe that every time you let that disease come back and recur, instead of treating it consistently, you're allowing damage to occur in the eye. Hence, our goal is to help patients see better longer, and more consistently. It is very important to consider how ophthalmologists are sort of on an island in the way they treat these chronic persistent diseases. I talked about how they treat them acutely. The comparison I always make for investors and for doctors, and I really challenge doctors on this, and I always get chuckles from the doctors because they haven't thought about it this way, is think about another chronic or persistent disease that one of your colleagues in another discipline might deal with, like hypertension or high blood pressure, right? I get treated for high blood pressure. My cardiologist doesn't treat my high blood pressure, once a day. Doesn't treat it once a month or once every 2 months with a big dose of drug and then send me home and have me come back. They treat it consistently every single day with a low dose of an ACE inhibitor or a diuretic or a combination to manage the disease consistently every day and keep it from coming back, right? They don't get your blood pressure under control over 110 to 110/70 and say, hey, Rick, your blood pressure looks good. Just go home and come back and see me when you have high blood pressure again. But that's what's happening in ophthalmology. They get the disease under control, the patient can see better, and then they send them home, and the patient comes back 30, 45, 60, 90 days later with worse vision again, and it needs to be treated again. This slide here is really a good example of what I'm talking about in the life of a patient over a period of time. So this is a typical DME patient being treated very frequently with these acute injections that last, like I said, 30, 60, 90 days. That purplish line there is looking at the anatomy or the thickness of the retina. So CRT stands for central retinal thickness over there on the left. To give you some perspective, a normal retina is 200 to 300 microns thick. So this patient's come in with a retina that is over 800 microns thick, very, very swollen compared to what would be normal. Every one of those arrows across the top is one of those acute therapies, short-term injections. You can see they get pretty good resolution. I mean, those drugs do work, and they work pretty well, and they get the edema to come down, but it's transient, and the efficacy wears off, and the edema comes back, and you get this constant waxing and waning over time. That is very traumatic for a patient, right? So my mother-in-law, she's unfortunately recently passed away, but she was being treated in both eyes before she passed away. And what's interesting is the disease needs to be managed uniquely for each eye. It doesn't always manifest itself the same way in each eye for each patient. So she was being injected with what's called anti-VEGF therapy, one of the acute therapies, once every 5 weeks in her left eye and once every 8 weeks in her right eye. And so the visits never really ever synced up. And if you play that out over the course of 3 years, and I use 3 years because our drug lasts for 3 years, that's 48 injection visits over the course of 3 years to go in and receive a needle in the eye. Okay. That's 48 times that she has a drug wearing off. She's waking up in the morning, trying to read the newspaper, realizes her vision's getting blurry. She's trying to look at one of her grandkids on a video chat, realizes she can't see him, can't read a book, whatever it may be. And the anxiety starts building up about, I got to go back into the doctor's office and I got to get another needle in the eye. So very, very traumatizing for a patient. And importantly, from a functional standpoint, as I said, we believe damage is occurring every time you allow the disease to come back, right? So if you look, the way you can see that on this chart is the yellow line is looking at visual acuity, or how well a patient can see. You can see this patient starts off with vision around 2200. Occasionally to the left side of the chart, they get some spikes. When the anatomy gets better, their vision comes back and they can see, and you can see they get as good as 2080 because this patient's pretty severe. But importantly, as you move to the right side of this chart, as the disease is allowed to wax and wane more and more often, even though you continue to see periodic improvements in the anatomy, you no longer see those same improvements in vision. And we believe that's because damage is occurring in the neurofiber layers in the eye. You're damaging the photoreceptors because you're allowing the disease to continue to come back. And therefore, the patient doesn't have great prospects for their vision long term. So this really is a good example of showing you what the need is in the space and why you want to keep that eye quiet for a longer period of time, and ultimately where the value is of what we provide. What we provide here is Iluvien. So Iluvien is engineered for sustained treatment. It's meant to provide what we call continuous microdosing, which is a very, very low dose of a corticosteroid called fluocinolone acetonide, to release it every single day for up to 3 years, to give you that consistency or mimic that systemic dose that a patient is getting every day for hypertension or high blood pressure, to try to do the same thing in the eye that you're doing when you take those systemic drugs. Iluvien is up there next to the tip of the pencil. To give you some perspective on its size, it is 3.5 millimeters long and 0.35 millimeters in diameter. You'd have to wet the tip of your finger to pick it up off the table. It's so light and small. We've actually done some playing around with that before, and we've looked at it, putting it on the Apple keyboard, and it fits inside the eye on your Apple keyboard. It's that small. And you can superimpose about 32 of those inside of a grain of rice. So it's very, very small. It is injected in the eye, just like the other drugs are. So it does require an injection. Very, very simple procedure. We have a proprietary needle and inserter, but the needle is a 25 gauge needle, and the importance of that is that needle is so small and so thin that it allows for a self-sealing wound. So there's no surgical intervention to get this implant inside the eye. It's done in the doctor's office in a 5-minute procedure, exactly like this acute therapies or shorter term therapies are done. and it self-seals and the patient can walk out, inpatient therapy. And then the drug or the insert sort of settles in the bottom of the eye of the vitreous and stays out of the field of vision in most patients. So very, very simple procedure, identical what the doctor's doing, already. And again, the drug is designed to elude the corticosteroid for up to 36 months. There are a lot of people out there trying to accomplish what we believe we already have in ophthalmology, which is providing that durability to address the issue and the challenge I just showed you. Most of those companies that are looking at more durability are frankly looking at erodible technology, because of the idea of leaving something in the eye. Well, there's a couple of things about the non-erodibility of our drug. First of all, if you have erodible technology, think about a gobstopper, right? It's slowly eroding, and you have less and less surface area exposed every day. And because you have less and less surface area, you ultimately get declining release, and you don't get the consistency of drug being released every day. Whereas our drug, because it is non-erodible technology, you have one end of that tube that's open. The tube itself is impermeable. One end has a silicone cap on it, and one end is left open. And it gives you consistent surface area, consistent exposure of drug, which means you get almost zero order kinetics and consistent delivery over the 3 years. So it's really the secret to the technology and the reason it works the way it does. A lot of people ask what happens when the drug leaves the eye or when you get rid of it. It's very, very safe. That little polyamide tube there, plastic tube there, has been used in ophthalmology in the eye for 40 or 50 years. It's the same material that's used to form the haptics of an intraocular lens, so an artificial lens that's put in the eye after cataract surgery. It's used to make the little springs on the side of an intraocular lens that hold it in the capsular bag or hold it in place. So very, very safe. Small interesting aside on how that was discovered and people started using that in the eye is the windshields in fighter planes in World War II were made out of polyamide, so plastic material. And when they get in a dogfight, the windshields would be fought up in these dogfights and the windshields would shatter. Pilots would get this plastic material in the eye. And they quickly realized that it was very safe, didn't lead to any infection and problems. So they didn't have to remove it from the pilot's eyes right away. They could take more of their time and do more diligent follow-up. And that was sort of how it was identified as a safe material in the eye and ultimately made its way into the intraocular lenses. So very, very safe material. And no issues with continuing to leave that in the eye after it runs out, and you could follow it up with a second or third. In fact, we do have patients that have had a second or third in their eye already. This slide here shows you really how Iluvien works and how it addresses the problem that I was mentioning in a real world setting. So this is looking at what we call the user study, which is a follow-up or retrospective analysis looking at 4 physician practices that used a lot of Iluvien in the first year of launch back in 2015, 2016. And what we did here is we were able to go back and have these physicians pull a lot of data on how the patients were performing before they received Iluvien and then how they performed after Iluvien. So how their lives changed after Iluvien. And when they received their Iluvien is sort of that dashed line you see in the middle of this slide. We stratified this based on how well the patients were doing on the shorter term therapies, because some patients were doing well, some patients were arguably refractory and failing on those therapies. So the green line at the top is looking at the patients that were arguably doing well. They were seeing 20/40 or better. 20/40 is an important measure of vision because that is typically driving vision in most states. And importantly, these patients were being treated an average of once every 2.9 months. So once every 3 months with the shorter term therapies, and they were seeing well. Doctor decided to switch them to Iluvien. And after they got Iluvien, they continued to maintain that high quality vision with much, much fewer relapses or recurrence of the disease. And they went from needing a treatment once every 2.9 months to once every 22 months. So about an 85% reduction in the recurrence of the disease and the need for retreatment while they maintain that high quality vision. If you look at the bottom line, you're looking at the worst of the worst patients. These are the patients that are going to be refractory to the drug, 2200 or worse, so nearing blindness. Importantly, still being treated an average of once every 3 months. And if you look up and down the left side of this chart, really regardless of how the patients were faring on the shorter term or acute therapies, they're still being treated about once every 3 months. Unlike my mother-in-law, the doctors aren't really able to customize the therapy to the extent they need to in the majority of these patients. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is simply the doctor's offices are overflowing with patients needing these injections. There's a huge demand because in addition to DME, doctors treat what's called wet AMD with a high number of injections very frequently as well. So volume in the patient's office and the physician's office. And then in addition to that, because these are diabetic patients, they have so many other comorbidities, so many other doctor's offices they're having to make. They're going to see their diabetologist, see their general physician, see their nephrologist for kidney issues, et cetera. They just can't get back into the ophthalmology office as often as they can and not able to customize that therapy. So that's consistent with the Medicare database as well, what we saw here in this study. But importantly, those patients that were not doing well or failing, they got an Iluvien and they saw a decrease in the recurrence of the disease, not as much as the patients that were doing better, because these are more severe patients, but they went from being treated once every 3 months to once every almost 7 months. So more than a 50% reduction in the recurrence of the disease and need for treatment. Very importantly, though, these patients saw a material improvement in their vision, right? So these patients gained 40 letters from the time they got their Iluvien until the end of this follow-up. And importantly, 40 letters for those, 20 letters, I apologize. 20 letters, for those of you that don't know, is the equivalent of about 4 lines on the eye chart that you would see in your optometrist or your ophthalmologist office. So imagine a 4-line improvement. That's a pretty material improvement in vision for patients that are, very challenged for their sight. So the takeaway is, get Iluvien on board early. And that's something we're trying to continue to promote because it does reduce the recurrence of the disease, reduces the need for those, frequent injections, and it's going to improve or maintain your vision, by having it on board, treating the disease consistently every day. A lot of people will ask if Iluvien works for 3 years, why do some of those patients need to be treated every, 22 months or every 7 months? It simply comes down to variability and the severity of disease across these patients. So I'm going to go back to my cardiology example again. Some people get 5 milligrams of an ACE inhibitor and their blood pressure is just fine. Some people need 10 milligrams of an ACE inhibitor and their blood pressure is fine. Some people need 10 milligrams of the ACE inhibitor plus a diuretic before their blood pressure is managed. And some people need even more than that. So it depends on the severity of the disease, and there are more severe DME patients. But in this case, 63% of the patients in our study or our analysis here got Iluvien and needed nothing else. It worked as monotherapy and they didn't need to be supplemented. And then about a third of the patients, a little more than a third of the patients, needed some sort of supplementation with the acute therapies, but much, much less frequently than they needed without Iluvien on board. And this is very consistent with what we see around numerous databases around the globe. Chris noted earlier that we've treated a lot of patients already. We've treated over 35,000 patients around the globe. So we've got a really good feel for how the drug works. And again, this percentage of monotherapy is pretty consistent with what we see around the globe. From a financial perspective, I touched on some of this, very, very strong growth rate from 17 to 18 to 19. That's about a 23% CAGR. We expected to continue to do the same in 2020 pre-COVID. And I'll just give you some small perspective on that. We did over 17 million in Q4 2019. We did over 14 million in Q1 of 2020. That drop, some of that's related to COVID kicking in late in the quarter. But usually we just have some seasonality associated with our business with insurance plans sort of resetting and everything at the beginning of the year and it being a fairly expensive product. But even with the COVID impact in Q1, that's over 31 million in that 6-month time span. And so you can pretty quickly, extrapolate that into a pretty significant growth rate over the 54 million we saw in 2019. And we certainly expect that we are going to be able to get back to that, as we continue to emerge from COVID. Very importantly, we achieved a big milestone in the company in 2019, which was break-even EBITDA. A little bit of history. I took over as CEO on January 1 of 2019. And my number one goal was to get the company to, break even from an EBITDA standpoint, start to generate cash operationally, because there had been a lot of history of overhang of, Alimera is going to continue to need more money and more cash, to get there. And I wanted to put an end to that. And so that was a huge milestone for us. Frankly, the critical mass and the stability we created in 2019 allowed us to survive COVID very, very well. Our revenue was, again, off only about 6%, but importantly, we managed the bottom line and we generated 3.5 million of EBITDA in 2020. And our balance sheet got stronger. You can see we went from 9.4 million of cash at the end of 2019 to a little over $1 million at the end of 2020. And we did not issue any equity in 2020. We didn't have to go back to the capital markets to sort of save the balance sheet and protect ourselves like most of our peer companies did. So, while COVID was going on, our shareholders didn't suffer any incremental dilution, and again, strengthened the balance sheet and really kept ourselves in position to really capitalize on, coming out of the COVID environment. There's a lot of opportunity for continued growth here. I feel like we're just scratching the surface. In the US, we've done surveys. Only about 50% of the doctors in the US have used our product. So there's a huge opportunity to continue to, grow usage, get new doctors using the product, and frankly, get doctors using it a lot earlier in the treatment paradigm. The concept that I was talking about earlier about how, Illuvien's a better mousetrap, a better way to treat the disease, really that only got shifted into our messaging in 2019 after I became the CEO, right? Getting doctors to think about this as a better way rather than the short-term therapies, as opposed to waiting for the shorter-term therapies to fail. And so using that kind of messaging, we expect to be able to get much earlier in the treatment paradigm. So more doctors will use it earlier on a broader number of patients. So a lot of opportunity there. And we think the New Day study, which I'll talk about again in a moment, really can contribute to that. Geographic expansion is a critical piece for us. We expect to continue to expand geographically and get into more countries, and I'll touch on that in a moment. We have another indication for a disease state called uveitis, which is a smaller indication that we have available to us in our European markets, and it's only been launched in 2 countries so far, so a lot of opportunity there. And then that option value, the New Day study, which I think can be the hockey stick for Alimera. From a footprint standpoint, we commercialize our product directly in the US and in Germany, the UK, Portugal, and Ireland over in Europe, as well as the Nordic countries. We're just rolling out the Nordic countries now. We have some partnerships in Southern Europe and the Middle East, and those partnerships, really help a lot. We're in about 11 or 12 countries right now, but we expect to, maybe be in 16, 17, 18 by the end of this year. So the geographic expansion is an important part of our revenue growth, but also, as I said, the broader that network can be, the better partner I can be for somebody else that wants to launch a product in the space. So this is a big focus, not only from a, growing revenue next year and the year after, but also strategically to try to create more value of our platform here. And importantly, as Chris noted, very excited to, announce an expansion yesterday to address, Greater China and the Western Pacific. This is a deal I've wanted to do for some time. Frankly, I abandoned the market in China because I thought the value of the transactions back in 2018, when I first looked at this, were not good enough. In this transaction, we've received a $10 million upfront as a license fee, and another $89 million in sales-based milestones related to the product license itself. And, to the extent I'm aware, it's the largest upfront that anybody's ever gotten for a retina product in China. And it's the largest cumulative deal anybody's ever gotten in China as well. So we're really proud of this one. In addition to the $10 million we get for the upfront, Ocumension also made a $10 million equity investment in the company at what I thought was a very good price as well, and really strengthens our balance sheet. And we've got some option value as well in Ocumension, which could provide some non-dilutive capital down the line. And I'm pretty excited about this. I don't think anybody's done this before, but we got a warrant for 1 million shares in their stock on the Hong Kong exchange. Just to give you some perspective, they have about a $2 billion valuation on the Hong Kong exchange that they've built up on some products that have much, much less potential than what Illuvien does. So could provide some non-dilutive capital down the line. And overall, this transaction is great for the company because it really does, further that message I've been trying to send, that we don't need to come back to the market for a lot of cash. Strengthens my balance sheet, puts me in a better negotiating position to look for the next thing to add to our bag as well. The other indication, uveitis, I'll touch on briefly. This is a smaller disease state. It's available to us only in our European markets, but it's only been launched in Germany and the UK so far. So we expect launches in 2021 in several other countries. It's a very inflammatory disease, typically treated with systemic doses of corticosteroids or autoimmune disease drugs. And those drugs also cause a lot of side effects in the body when they're delivered systemically. So the idea of getting something delivered locally to the eye to reduce the recurrence of the disease makes a lot of sense. You can see here in the data, that we do indeed reduce that recurrence, right? So in the trial, which is a 36-month trial, the control arm had its average first recurrence at about 10 weeks. Iluvien stretched that out to 94 weeks. So almost a 10-fold improvement in that disease-free recurrence period of time. And we reduced the number of recurrences too, right? The mean number of recurrences over 3 years in the control arm was over 5, and Iluvien was under 2. So about a 65% reduction in the recurrence of the disease. So we're doing exactly what I'm telling you to do with DME and uveitis. And we're very excited about this because there's a lot less competition in this space. So even though it's a smaller space, we think it can provide significant incremental revenue over the next 2 to 3 years in these other markets. And then lastly, the New Day study. New Day study, because Alimera actually means in modern Greek, a new day or good morning. And we think this is a new day for patients as well. As I said, we're going to be assessing Iluvien in a head-to-head comparison against a corticosteroid called Eylea, which is a $7.5 billion drug. Nobody's ever done that. I'm really proud of that. I like the run with the little guy story, and we're certainly trying to punch above our weight and put our money where our mouth is because we believe we can win this comparison. And as I said, we've treated 35,000 patients around the globe, so we sort of know how our drug works when we wrote this protocol. I'm not going from a 5-rat, preclinical study to a big clinical trial, and I've treated more than 20 patients in a safety study. I know how my drug works. We believe we're going to demonstrate reduced disease recurrence. I just showed you one database where we have that. We've got many databases that show that, so we're comfortable with that. And we believe we're going to show better control, which will lead to better long-term results for that patient. We're doing a couple of groundbreaking studies on cytokine levels, which is basically inflammatory markers in the eye, and looking at that neurofiber functionality and ERG studies as well. Nobody's ever done that. And the point is not just showing the doctors the efficacy, but why it works better to provide another barrier for entry for other products coming forward. We're going to show them why it works as well. It's an 18-month study, about 300 patients over 40 sites. We've got all the sites activated right now. Enrollment's a little bit slow because of COVID, but our goal is to try to get those 300 patients enrolled by the end of the first quarter. And again, confidence is really high based on what we've seen in the real world studies. So I'm not going to go back through the investment thesis again. I think I've hit these all pretty hard. I'd probably more efficient if I hand it back to Chris and it open up for questions.
Rick, thank you again for the presentation. We have quite a few questions, so let me know when you're ready and we'll go through them.
I'm ready. Fire away, please.
Does Alimera own all of its technology outright, or do we license from other companies?
Yeah, so we don't. We actually license the technology underlying the little insert or tube from the predecessor company, but it's now a company called iPoint, which is a public company, EYPT. So we own that tube, and we pay them about a 6% royalty on our sales globally.
What was COVID's biggest negative impact for you guys last year, and how has the dynamic changed already early this year?
Yeah, so great question. Two things really. One is obviously limited our ability from a commercial team to get out there in the field and go visit doctors because doctors' offices were closed. And frankly, even if they were open, they didn't want any unnecessary third parties in there potentially, bringing the disease because of, the separation they were seeking. Frankly, though, the other piece was a lack of patient volumes in all these doctors' offices.
Yep.
Doctors' offices patient volume was down probably 80% in April, May, June, and it continued to stay down more so for diabetic patients, again because of all the comorbidities and them being higher risk. So we've seen that return. I think most doctors would say they've got 80%, 85% of their volume back, but that would not necessarily apply ratably to the DME patients because of that same thing. We saw it return and get better over the course of the year. And frankly, sales and revenue came back really strong in October, November, even early December. I think people really shut down over the holidays more last year than they ever did. And we saw some of our typical seasonality in the first quarter. And we've coached people that, revenue will be down, 20% like it always is Q4 to Q1. The one thing that surprised me a little bit, Chris, in Q1 was diabetic patients started postponing visits again because they were in the vaccine cycle, right? And so they had a vaccine appointment scheduled and they didn't want to take a risk that they would get COVID and then have to miss that vaccine appointment. We saw that start to alleviate again in March as we hit the numbers going above 75% of the phase 1A patients being vaccinated. But that was a unique, little piece I didn't anticipate.
And to follow up on that, do you think that there's any real pent up demand from last year switching over to this year?
Um, I'd like to see that, but we haven't seen that yet. We haven't seen that yet. I think as some of these patients are coming back, it depends on the doctor. There's some doctors that have clearly seen the incremental value of Iluvien in this situation, right? Because a patient has missed a visit and come back with more severe vision loss than they've ever had before. And they've seen the value in an Iluvien patient that's been able to maybe afford a skip visit. And so some doctors are maybe moving to Iluvien a little bit earlier because of it. Other doctors are overwhelmed, right? Because they have this bolus of patients coming back in and they're just quickly going back to what they did before, right? And without taking the time to really evaluate what that patient needs. So we haven't seen that bolus yet, but I do believe that we do have more advocates out there that are seeing the value of Iluvien that will help us in the longer term because of an event like COVID. Because it's a good thing to point to say, if you ever have a patient that has to miss a visit, it's good to have Iluvien on board and have the value of treating the disease consistently every day in the eye.
Understood. There's a couple questions about DME. Excuse me. How big is the DME market today in the US
Yep.
in terms of number of patients? And then how has that number changed since 2000?
Yeah, so we think overall the prevalence is about 650,000 patients, maybe 700,000 patients in the US. Probably about 45% to half of those have been treated, right? A lot of people, frankly, aren't being seen to the extent they should be seen and being treated. If somebody is really suffering with diabetes, they should be seeing the retina specialist once every 6 months. My mother's diabetic as well. She does that. However, a lot of these patients, frankly, because they've been beat up their entire lives and told them that diabetes is their fault, they accept the fact that their loss of vision is sort of their lot in life, and they don't go see physicians. What's interesting is we're seeing that sort of change, and that 45% may have grown to 50% over the last year because bigger companies like Regeneron are spending money behind trying to drive patients into the office to be treated a little bit more. So hopefully that gap closes, and you continue to see more patients coming through the office, which frankly works well for us, right? Because more volume means doctors have to manage that volume better, and we can help them manage that volume.
And in terms of geographic basis, in regards to DME, is the US the largest market? And what are the second and third largest markets in the world?
Yeah. So the largest market ultimately is probably going to be China, right? Because there's 130 million diabetics in China, right? So it's a huge, huge market. Although what percentage of those patients are being treated right now, honestly, I don't know the answer to that. So US is the largest market for us right now. Our second largest market is Germany, probably. However, our French market is doing very, very well. And what's interesting is if you go to Europe, in Southern Europe, they're more aggressive with steroids and they're more aggressive with the longer term treatments because it is more nationalized healthcare, right? So they want to be more efficient in the way they treat these patients. And so our launch in France has gone extremely well over the last 2 years, and may quickly surpass Germany, because Germany is more like the US. It's more private practice. And the doctors, manage the patient flow themselves versus the need from an efficiency from a national network standpoint.
With the 2,000 specialists that we rely on here in the States, how many has the company directly reached out to? And how do we convince them that we do have indeed a better mousetrap?
Yeah. So it's we probably reach about 80% of those, have those as targets. And we certainly have that 80% filtered into, tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. It's been tough. It's been tough over COVID just because you can't visit them. But I think one of the things we did really well as a company is I never shut down the field force officially. So, a lot of bigger companies said, we're pulling everybody out of the field. And my message to the field was, you need to do what you need to do in your market based on your local restrictions. So I understand if you need to work from home. And I gave people a lot of flexibility to do what they needed to do. And what happened was our people, to some extent, stayed in touch with doctors a lot more because they weren't pulled out. They continued to use text and email and phone and video chats to stay in touch with them. And a lot of doctors felt like we stayed in touch with them better. So I think we've stayed in touch, but now there's going to be an opportunity to get out there and see them more. And in fact, I haven't looked at the full quarter yet, but January and February, our in-person visits in January and February was already above what we had been able to do in October, November, December. So we're seeing that access come back. And then it is driving ahead with that messaging, focusing on the better mousetrap, the advocacy. We're trying to work with a lot of younger retina groups. There's a group called the American Retina Forum that is a group of younger doctors that are becoming, more outspoken in their advocacy. Working with groups like that to get more peer-to-peer information spread between the doctors that are using Iluvien to the doctors that are not, to kind of put that pressure out there.
If you are ultimately not using Iluvien, what other options do you have to treat DME currently on the market?
Yeah, so they're using one of four products, and three of them are all in the same class. So they're using what's called anti-VEGF therapy, which is anti-vascular endothelial growth factor. Basically helps stimulate the growth of new blood vessels when the tissue is dying or being starved of oxygen. And what happens is those blood vessels contribute to the leaking. So doctors are injecting that therapy, once every month, 2 months, 3 months. It addresses the vascular component of the disease, and it works very well. The opportunity for us, though, is most doctors, or many doctors, and this is happening on the podium in publications, are beginning to discuss the fact that DME is more of an inflammatory disease and not just a vascular disease. So I mentioned cytokines and inflammation and talking about the New Day study, that these cytokines that aren't addressed by the anti-VEGFs play a big, big role. And that's where steroids come in. So there's a shift in this discussion of anti-VEGF therapies don't work great. And we're seeing more and more use of steroids. And that's where some of the opportunity lies for us. There's only one other steroid out there, and it's called Ozurdex, which is Allergan's product. It is a shorter term steroid. It's an erodible device that I was referring to, and it lasts for 2 to 3 months. So really competing against two anti-VEGFs, Lucentis, which is Novartis and Genentech, or Eylea, which is Regeneron's, and then Allergan's product, Ozurdex.
These next few questions are in regards to the procedure. Rick, can you go through what a typical patient goes through during the day of the procedure, and how long does it take from start to finish?
Yeah, a lot of waiting in the waiting room, right? We hear that these visits take, 2.5 to 3 hours because the patients wait so long. Typically, the procedure itself, the injection is, as I said, a 5 or 10 minute procedure. They're getting, a little bit of betadine typically on the eye, just to prevent any infection. And the doctor, it's literally an in and out procedure because it's a very, very sharp needle with all these. But again, it's the same across all the issues. It's a lot of waiting. They will typically do an OCT where they're looking at the thickness of the retina. They're doing a visual check. A lot of times they don't have to dilate these patients, but most of the time is simply waiting in the office, right? So if we can reduce the number of visits, certainly, again, helps these patients with all their other issues.
Do you guys disclose what a typical procedure costs, and is it completely covered by insurance?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to talk about it. So in the US, our drug, the list price is $8,800. The procedure fee is the same for all those other injections. It's a CPT code that's roughly $100 per injection. Covered very, very well by all the insurance. Within 30 days of us, or 90 days of us launching the drug, we had coverage with 24 of the top 25 payers, and it's covered completely by Medicare. Average price in Europe, very good coverage over there, is anywhere from 6,000 euros to 8,000 euros. We probably net about 6,000 euros. It sounds expensive, but to give you some perspective, in the US, the shorter term drugs range anywhere from $1,200 per injection to $1,800 per injection. Eylea, the drug that we're going against in the New Day study, is $1,800 per injection. And its label requires 5 monthly injections before the patients go to a monitoring phase, and you can maybe start to stretch those injections out to 8 weeks or 12 weeks if they're less severe patients. At $1,800 injection, that's $9,000 just for the loading dose to get you for the first 5 months. So we're very efficient for the system at $8,800.
How many procedures are currently being done in Canada on an annualized basis?
We are not available in Canada at this point in time. We have a partner up there that's been working on pricing and reimbursement's a challenge right there right now.
Okay, and now these are the Ocumension questions because there are several.
Sure.
How long were we in contact with Ocumension before finalizing a deal?
So, you could say 3 years and you could say 6 weeks. So I started looking in China back in 2018, made about 2 or 3 trips over there and was working with Ocumension. But because of Trump putting the tariffs in place and the Chinese stock exchange coming down, and frankly, some people doing some deals for much lesser upfronts in ophthalmology, what I was looking for as far as an 8-figure upfront license fee dwindled down into the low 7 figures, and I just punted and walked away. I was actually, my team was dealing with business development people back then. I was reintroduced to the CEO through some common investors literally 6 weeks ago last night. I had my first conversation with the CEO. We agreed this was something we needed to do, and we hammered out a letter of intent within about 3 or 4 days, and our team's got it all done over the last 6 weeks.
How big is the company, and what type of market cap does Ocumension have in Hong Kong?
So Ocumension has a market cap of about $1.6 billion today. It's a pretty small company as far as number of employees. I think right now they've got less than 40 or 50 employees. It is the executive team is the former executive team, or at least part of the former executive team of Santen in China. And it was formed specifically, much like we are, a little bit broader in ophthalmology, but to focus on ophthalmology. So they are doing some things in the front of the eye versus just the back of the eye, but specific focus on ophthalmology.
From the 10 million Ocumension invested, is Alimera giving the company any warrants in our company?
No, not at all. I mean, it's a straight equity investment. The price was $8.73 a share, which is obviously a discount to where we are today, but it was about an 8% discount to where we were trading when I finalized the transaction. And so keep in mind, how that would compare if I tried to do something in the market with paying bankers and stuff. And it's restricted for a year, and it's not registered stock. So I thought it was very good pricing, and there's no other bells and whistles. In fact, I got the warrant in them instead.
So let me tell you, to all our listeners, everyone kind of asks me from time to time if there is a silver bullet, an indicator in the microcap space that if it happens, it's almost always a positive harbinger, if you will. This is one of those harbingers where there's a much, much larger company coming in and investing in a smaller market cap, in this case, Alimera. It very rarely happens. So I was going to tell you, Rick, the last company that did this was a company called Camtech, C-A-M-T.
Mm-hmm.
They had a Taiwanese company buy 20% of it, around $8 or $9 a share. And naturally, Camtech is now 34 and counting. So just a small tidbit for everyone tuning in. How long is the licensing deal for?
Yeah, so it's a 10-year deal. But it will continue on perpetually as long as they're continuing to commercialize product, right? So it's very similar to what our deal is for some of the underlying technology with iPoint. As long as we're continuing to sell, the license goes on forever. And so we did the same thing there. And I actually did that for one very important reason, right? Some of the IP in China runs out in 2027. The non-compete that's built in the agreement is for 10 years now, but that non-compete will stay in place forever, right? So, like many people, skeptical of, would they try to reverse engineer this in China at some point and try to do that. And so we came to an agreement on, matching up the non-compete in a way that it stays in place to give us that longer term protection.
And then can you talk about the dynamics of diabetes in Asia? Is it as prominent there as it is here in the States?
Yeah, it's actually higher, right? So as I said, there's 129, million diabetics in China. Probably more than 130 million now. So that's probably about a 11% rate. And I think the US rate is slightly less than that. Interestingly, a lot of people point to the emergence of the Western diet in China, as contributing to that. If any of you have ever been, you can't walk through Shanghai or Beijing without seeing a KFC or McDonald's on the corner. It's so it's had a huge rise over the last 10 years, and I think that's contributed to it quite a bit.
Respect. So now what we're going to do is we're going to look on the Q&A side of the Zoom app and see if there's any questions. There are several, so let me open it up. Okay. Scott says, this appears to be great for the patient, but bad for the doctor's economics. See patients once every 3 years versus seeing a patient multiple times per year. We know who usually wins that battle. How do you sell into that conflict with the doctor? Thank you for the question.
So it's Scott, it's a great question. It's the right question because that is some of the perception of some of the doctors, but it's actually not really true. So from an economic standpoint, the doctors do make money on all these drugs and the number of injections. We've done some analysis with a few doctors where we've gone back and looked at patients on each one of the alternatives Andaluven over the course of 3 years. And although they bill a lot more, for Eylea, for example, they bill somewhere in that $35,000, $36,000 range for drugs and procedures and stuff over 3 years. and they bill for 11 or 12 of the Iluvien, the margin that they make is much closer. It's about $5,400 over 3 years for Eylea and about $4,700 for Iluvien. And then if you break that down further on a per visit basis, because they have to see the Iluvien patient less often, it's about $230 per visit. And Iluvien, so therefore Iluvien is just as profitable on a per visit basis and opens up more space in the practice. Some of the more business savvy doctors get that, but we need to continue to get that message out there. And we are collecting pharmacoeconomic data in the New Day study to be able to tell that story. Two other things that will help us there. The anti-VEGFs that are the biggest issue here are coming off patent over the next 12 to 18 months. Biosimilars are coming along, which means pricing pressure is going to come down, which means the margin on those drugs they're going to make is going to come down as well. Should be in our favor. There's also some people out there challenging rebates the doctors gets on these drugs. And Eylea is number one on the Medicare list of drugs, most expensive drugs to the system, and so is Lucentis. And so although Trump's most favored nation status on getting pricing on the top 50 Medicare drugs was not implemented and postponed, Biden's administration has said they want to bring the pricing of those drugs down too, which will impact the doctors. We're not on that list. So we think there's a lot of things out there that will help us over time as we get that message out there. But it is one of the things that does inhibit growth.
So Rick, just to let you know, we still have 9 questions in the queue, but about 6 minutes. So we kind of.
All right, I'll try to be more efficient with my answer.
Oh, no. I'm just, I should have done a better job of letting you know what the clock is like.
Yep.
Bo asks, when will the first results from the New Day project be published?
It won't be till 2023. It won't be till 2023. So the first is an 18-month look. So it'll be 18 months from the time we get the enrollment done.
What's the timeline for launching Iluvien in Canada?
Don't know. It's on hold right now because we're waiting for pricing and reimbursement.
And in this case, are patients returning to clinics after getting their COVID-19 injection, as mentioned on the conference call in Q4?
Are they coming back to the practice? Is that what you asked?
I think so. Yeah. Or returning?
Yes, they are. Yes, they are. I mean, we think we saw a rise in volumes and patient visits in March, for sure. So we think, as I said, I think as they're getting their vaccinations, and you see that vaccination number go up, it's getting more patients through the practices.
And I see another gentleman I know who is a sad Oakland Athletics fan is also asking, will the Ocumension $10 million license fee be booked as sales revenue? And then when will Ocumension start sales in China?
So it won't be, we will not book it in the same line item as gross sales as we normally do. But it should run through income in the second quarter. We would expect the 10 million to run through income in the second quarter. As far as timing, right now I'm telling people expect 3 to 4 years before they actually hit the market in China, because the perception right now is that they are going to have to run a clinical trial. And so conservatively, we want to say 3 to 4 years. They are looking at ways to try to, make that shorter, because we do have such a volume of data around the globe, and, there may be a positive development there, but right now I would not commit to anything more than earlier than 3 or 4 years.
We have 3 questions from AA or anonymous attendee. How might the 2027 patent expiration affect your costs and the competitive environment?
Yeah, so I'm not overly concerned about the 2027 patent expiration. And the reason for that is it's very difficult to demonstrate bioequivalence in the eye, right? So you can't test systemic levels of fluocinolone acetonide to determine equivalence. You can't, take fluid from the back of the eye. And what that means is if you're doing a retina drug, somebody would have to run a clinical study to demonstrate bioequivalence, which means they have to use Iluvien, a 9,000 drug as the comparator, run a 3-year study. It could be done, but it would be a very expensive and time-consuming study, and it's not the typical path that a generic company does. So we think we've got a barrier there in that.
Will you need to pay license fees post-patent expirations?
We will continue to pay the 6% royalty as long as we're selling product and the license in place.
Have you considered combining sales efforts with EyePoint in the US?
Not really, because we don't think that it brings that much to the table to us, right? They're calling on uveitis specialists only. And a lot of times those are specialists in university systems or hospital systems, that we don't necessarily call on. So we think we could expand their coverage, but they wouldn't really expand our coverage too much.
Okay, so someone is now crapping on me and my Texas Rangers, so I have to counteract, Rick. I can't let this happen.
Sure.
I don't know how to type in. So so we have a couple minutes left. Here are my questions. Okay. And look, you and I have known each other for for quite some time. How many more Ocumensions are out there? Because I know that you guys are still relatively small on a standalone basis,
Hmm.
and this was a big deal. Are there other pockets of the world, in this case, say South America
Yeah.
or Africa or parts of Europe,
Yeah.
that you can essentially go to a much bigger player that understands the culture and the process and the healthcare dynamics, that can use this phenomenal technology and expand it without us and the learning curve and the cost of building infrastructure there?
Yeah, the three places that I think we would consider going next would be, the Russian territories would be one. And we've had some conversations there, although, nothing imminent and nothing that's really picked up momentum. Looking at South America, as you suggested. And then, I'd like to find ways to see if the Indian market would make sense to us. We do have about 200 patients in the original clinical studies that were done in sites in India. And I think there might be an opportunity there. So, we are looking at those, although I will tell you clearly, I think that, China and the Asian markets is the most valuable, there. So I don't know there'd be a transaction the size of what we just did or not.
And my final question is, what do you think the street doesn't give Alimera any credit for? Because if you look at the dynamics, and I don't mean to piss you off, healthcare is hot, med tech is hot,
Yeah.
biotech is hot. And then you look at your valuation in relation with kind of the other players in the field. And I'm not even going to mention Regeneron because, they're a much bigger company. But what do you feel you guys need to do to earn that street cred?
Yeah.
And
So I think it's two things. I think, the typical pharmaceutical investor out there is not looking at us because we don't have that sexy pipeline asset, right? That has a 10% chance of succeeding that people are willing to bet on, right? I ultimately would like to add something to the pipeline, but we've got an established business. So I'm not gonna make a short-term decision and bring something, overly risky into the pipeline unless I've got a lot of confidence it's going to work. But frankly, I do have some money now and some dry powder to go look for that, right? The other piece is, pharmaceutical investors, don't see steroids as sexy, right? They've been around for years. But the point I always make is, why steroids have been used in the eye for 40 or 50 years? Because they work, right? And they work extremely well. And I don't think they're going away. I think, us doing this New Day study and showing how it validates very well against, the more sexy anti-VEGFs is a huge thing for us. And I have great expectations of that study, again, because I've treated 35,000 patients. I know how the drug works. And that should be an inflection point for us. And I think I can continue to grow, in that, high teens to mid 20s growth rate while I'm waiting to get there too.
I didn't want to put you on the spot, but for all our listeners, I usually do a fun fact for each executive when it comes to private meetings so that there's some type of icebreaker. I think yours may be the most interesting one thus far this year. You doing 50,000 push-ups last year.
Yeah.
Can you tell the entire audience what you learned from doing this, and are your triceps a lot stronger as a result of this?
I don't know if my triceps are a lot stronger, but I do feel like I'm in better shape overall than I've been in a long time. So it came out of a little virtual happy hour that I did early last May with our Southeastern sales team. Alimera is a family company. Everybody at this company has my cell phone number. I got the open door policy, and I hopped on a little virtual happy hour one evening with the Southeast sales team, and turned out there were 2 or 3 of them having this contest, and they asked me to join, and we started tracking our push-ups every day. And I tell you, it built a great amount of camaraderie. We actually had one young woman in the office join the group, and she worked her way up to doing 300 push-ups a day for a week, doing it and stuff. And it was really just a great team exercise, and no pun intended, getting us doing it together, and built some relationships, frankly, that will never go away. We still trade messages about it today.
So I want to make sure that you know this. That if you use your knees, it is not a push. I cannot stress this enough, you guys.
I have a 15-year-old son comes in once in a while and tries to tell me that I'm not doing them right. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. So where could we find out more information about the company?
Definitely on our website. There's a very significant presentation out there on the New Day study itself. But also I'm accessible. I love talking to investors. Happy to set up individual calls with anybody on this webcast anytime you'd like. Chris and his team certainly have my contact information, and I'm again happy to set something up.
Respect. And if I didn't ask, if I didn't get to any of the questions by way of email, I apologize. I'll forward it to the company. Rick, it's always a pleasure seeing you. I will connect with you on the other side.
Great. Thank you, sir. You guys have a great day.
Be well.